Welcome back to my shop. I'm Chris with DGX out in Utah, and today we're here at the shop. We're going to talk about lower receivers. A lot of people ask me questions all the time, and so one of the main questions people ask me is about lower receivers. And so I'm going to start off from the very beginning. Let's talk about 80%. What's an 80% lower receiver? An 80% receiver has been 80% completed. Usually they start off, there's two types of receivers that are out there. There's a milled receiver or billet, and there's a forged. The difference between the two, the billet or the milled receiver has been put as an aluminum block, a pure block, onto a milling machine, and a machinist has gone through and milled the entire thing to certain specifications. A forged one, though, is entirely different. What they do is they take the metal and they have a mold and they force the hot aluminum, usually, into the mold to create the actual casing of a forged receiver. This right here that I'm holding in my hands is a forged receiver from a company, and it's 95% complete. But let's go back to the 80% complete. What is the 80%? Most of them are going to be a billet or a machined 80%. You're not going to have your pocket that you see in here. It's going to be completely filled in. The other piece that's not going to be completed, and it's not on this one, but you can see it up here on the receivers that I have up here, is there's a trigger hole for a trigger pin, there's a hammer pin hole here, and then the safety selector hole. This receiver right here does not have those holes put into it. That's why we call this a 95% complete, because that's the last two steps. A lot of people want to have a firearm that doesn't have any serial numbers on it. An 80% lower does not have any serial numbers. There's no engravings, there's no makers, manufacturers, or any other design or logos on it usually. And what most of the public can do with it is they can mill out their own trigger pocket and hammer pocket, which is right in here. And then once they do that, they can cut their actual holes for their trigger, their hammer, and their safety selector. At that point, they will have a receiver that it's going to be set up that will work as a firearm, but it won't have any serialized numbers on them. Now, according to ATF rulings and laws, you can have those receivers as the general public. There's nothing wrong with you owning them, but you cannot sell them. That is against the law. Any firearm that gets sold, whether it's from a dealer to a dealer, a dealer to the general public, or the general public to another person in the general public, there has to be a serial number involved. And it is against the law to take an 80% receiver that has been milled out and completed, so technically at that point it's 100%, but there's no serial number on it. It's against the law to transfer it to somebody else or to sell it to somebody else. So that's where a lot of the misconceptions come from with 80% is, can I sell it? Can I keep it? Is it against the law? There's nothing wrong with you having it. There is nothing against the law with you making your own firearm. It is all completely legal to do that in any fashion that you want to do. And with the 80%, it's the easiest. Again, all you have to do is mill out the trigger pockets and then drill your holes for your hammer, your trigger, and your safety selector. The next question that I get a lot of people asking me is, well, what kind of lower receivers do you buy? I have looked and scoured the internet and all over the different sources for the receivers. And I have come up with the best baseline is going to be a mil-spec receiver. That's going to be the best overall, that's going to mate up with just about every other upper receiver and parts. So when I look into a receiver, the first thing that I want to know is that the aluminum is going to be mil-spec. Military specifications for the aluminum used in lower receivers is 7075 T6 aluminum. So that's got to be the base for the receivers that I look for. The next, they've got to have either a hard coat anodized coating over the top or a phosphate. I like the hard coating a little bit more. It's a little bit more rugged, holds up in the metal a little bit more, but the phosphate is still a good coating over the top of it. The thing that I've found is that other things dealing around the lower receivers from other manufacturers is they'll change some of the sizing in the specs. I don't like moving or changing any of the specs. I want to keep my rifles as reliable as possible. The only way to keep your rifles as reliable as possible is to keep it as general as possible. Again, these guns are so versatile. You can use any part on it from any different manufacturer. So you got to keep the specs as much the same. And 99% of the manufacturers do that. They do their best. But there is some receivers that are out there that they're just not up to those par. So mil-spec sizing, we could go through all of them and I could pull out my calipers and show you all that stuff, but it would really bore you because it's just talking numbers. But make sure that they are all military specifications. One of the biggest things that we run into with that, though, especially from manufacturers, is they'll tell you that, well, our lower receiver is mil-spec. Well, okay, in what aspect is it mil-spec? Is it the hard coating on the outside? Is it the measurements? Is it the diameter? Is it the aluminum? I've seen so many manufacturers, they misrepresent that statement by saying, well, my stuff is mil-spec. They could mean one little piece of the entire receiver. I could coat this black, hard coat, anodize it, and say it's mil-spec. Well, it's mil-spec coating, but the aluminum underneath is a different coating or a different type, or there's different pins drilled in different areas, or the pinholes are going to be a different size. So be very careful when looking for all those things. Again, we stick with military specifications or mil-spec as much as we can, but we need to make sure as much of that is going to be on there. Other than that, most of your lower receivers, you're going to come into just different shapes, different forms, different sizes, but as long as they're mil-spec, you're going to be really good with everything. The last thing that I'm going to tell you is the billets. Again, we talked about them in the very beginning. We're going to talk about them right now. Most of them are going to be the same size as a forged, or they're going to be oversized, or they're going to have just a little bit different tweaks. And one of the tweaks that you're going to find on them, such as this one, is there's no trigger guard on here. The trigger guard is actually missing. It's an accessory that we can put on this. But a billet is more than likely going to come with one. They're going to be just arranged in different ways that the manufacturer wants to do it. Because again, the billet or the milled is coming off of a machine, which a machinist has actually set up the drawings and the plans for. So don't get discouraged if you see one. If you actually pick one up and you go, well, that's not the way that the one at the last store felt, or that's not the way that my buddy Bob's over here feels. It's just because it's all different manufacturers are going to set theirs up differently when it comes to the milling. I prefer the forged because there's a lot of little differences that are going to come into them, but they're a lot smaller. They're going to be so universal, it's going to be ridiculous. There's not going to be a lot of differences between the forged versions, and that's the way that the lower receivers are put together. Just remember, keep the specs, make sure they have all the specs, and you should be good. One of the things about a lower receiver that not a lot of people realize is this is the gun that the ATF is looking for. Anytime that you fill out paperwork that registers a gun into your name, on an AR, this is the piece. This is the registered component. This is the piece that has the serial number on it, and that they care where it came from, where it's at, or where it's going to. So this, again, is the way that it is. And 80% lower, though, is not. It is not serialized. The ATF does not consider it a firearm at that point in its 80% form. So that's why you can go onto the internet, you can buy 80% lowers all day long. They can be shipped into your house. But this lower receiver, if you were to buy it from a manufacturer, from a dealer such as myself, or from anybody else, technically this is the part that the ATF wants to know where it's at, that it's in your possession, or if you've taken it and given it, sold it, or loaned it to somebody else. Any other questions, comments, feel free to reach out to us. Again, I'm Chris with Dixie Gun Works out in Utah. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you soon.